He was going to wed her, and if he thought differently on either point, she intended to set him straight. There was only the small matter of his bond to Moiraine to deal with. She could have screamed in frustration. She was 100 paces down the road before the others caught up, glancing at her sideways. Elaine only sniffed loudly while struggling to readjust the 2 large bundles on her back. She would have to take everything, but Brigitte strode along pretending to speak under her breath, yet quite audibly muttering about women who rushed off like Carpan girls leaping from a river cliff. Nynaeve ignored them equally. The men spread out, Galad in the lead, flanked by Tom and Juilin, the Shienarans in a long file to either side, wary eyes searching every withered bush and fold in the ground. Walking in the middle of them, Nynaeve felt foolish. You would have thought they expected an army to rise up out of the ground. You would have thought she and the other 2 women were helpless, especially when the Shienarans silently followed Uno's lead and unlimbered their swords. Why, there was not a human being in sight. Even the shanty villages appeared abandoned. Galad's blade remained in its scabbard, but Juilin began hefting his thumb-thick staff instead of using it for a walking stick, and knives appeared in
Hey,
Tom's
Benny.
hands
Hey,
and
John
vanished,
McDonald. How you
as if
doing,
he was
bro?
unconscious of what he was doing.
Thanks for stopping by.
Even Brigitte fitted an arrow
I
to her bow.
appreciate it.
Nynaeve shook her head.
How's
It would take a
y'all's
brave
night
mob
going?
to come in eye shot of this lot. Then they reached Samara, and she began to wish she had accepted Petra's offer, and the Chavanas, and anyone else's.
Hell yeah, John McDonald.
The gates stood open and unguarded, and 6 black columns of smoke rose above the grey town walls.
The streets beyond were still. Real quick.
Shattered glass from broken windows crunched underfoot. That was the only sound, except for a distant buzz, like monstrous swarms of wasps.
I hope all y'all are doing good today.
Furniture and bits of clothing littered the
Getting
paving
down to the last of my dabs.
Things dragged from shops and homes, whether by looters or by people fleeing, there was no way to tell. Not only property had been destroyed. In one place, a corpse of fine green silk coat hung half out of a window, limp and unmoving. In another, a fellow garbed in rags dangled by his neck from the eaves of a tinsmith's shop. Sometimes down a side street or alley, she caught a glimpse of what might have been discarded bundles of old clothes. She knew they were left. In one doorway, where the splintered door hung crazily by a single hinge, small flames licked up around a wooden staircase, smoke just beginning to trickle out. The street might be empty now, but whoever had done that was not long gone. Head swiveling, trying to watch every way at once, Nynaeve took a firm hold on her belt knife. Sometimes the angry buzz grew louder, a wordless guttural roar of rage that seemed no more than 1 street over, and sometimes it faded to a dull murmur. Yet, when trouble came,
hell yeah,
came
Bailey.
suddenly
Definitely appreciate it.
The mass of men stalked around the next corner but one, like a pack of hunting wolves, jamming the street from side to side, soundless but for the thud of boots. The sight of Nynaeve and the others was a torch tossed into a haystack.
Hard to hear. Let me
There
turn
was
it up a little bit.
As one, they surged forward, howling and rabid, waving pitchforks and swords, axes and clubs, anything that could be taken to hand for a weapon.
Hey, Nightmare.
Enough anger still clung
How's that, Benny?
for her to embrace Saidar, and she did it without thinking, even before she saw the
no problem, brother.
around Elaine. There were a dozen ways she could halt this mob by herself. A dozen more she could destroy if she chose, not for the possibility of Mogadeen. She was not sure whether the same thought held Elaine. She only knew that she hung on to her anger and the true source of her fervor, and it was Mogadeen more than the onrushing rabble that made it hard. She hung on to them and knew she dared do nothing, not if there was any other chance. Almost she wished she could cut the flows being woven by Elaine. There had to be some other chance. One man, a tall fellow in a ragged red coat that had belonged to someone else once by its green and gold embroidery, ran out in front of the others on long legs, shaking a wood axe overhead. Brigitte's arrow took him through one eye.
Hell yeah, baby.
He went down in a sprawling heap.
How's your day going, Fire?
Others, all contorted faces and wordless screams. Nothing was going to stop them.
I'm just rolling a little something up right now.
Half pure fear, Nynaeve jerked her belt knife free and at the same time prepared to channel. Like Like a wave striking boulders, the charge splintered on Shienaran's steel. The top-knotted men, not much less ragged than those they fought, worked their two-handled swords methodically, craftsmen at their craft, and the onslaught went no farther than their thin line. Men fell screaming for the prophet, but more scrambled over them. Julian, the fool, was in that row, flat-topped conical cap perched on his dark head, thin staff a blur that deflected stabs, broke arms, and cracked skulls. Tom worked behind the
How's
line,
everyone's
his limp strong as he darted
weekend
from
been
place to
so
place
far?
to confront the few who managed to wriggle through. Only a dagger in either hand, yet even swordsmen died on those blades. The gleeman's leathery face was grim, but when one bulky fellow in a blacksmith's leather vest nearly reached Elaine with his pitchfork, Tom snarled as viciously as any in the mob, and very nearly cut the man's head off while slitting his throat. Through it all, Brigitte calmly
Hell
shifted
yeah,
from
Nightmare.
spot
That's the
to
best
spot,
thing right there.
every arrow finding
Especially
an
if you're
eye.
camping.
Yet if they held the
Smoke
mob,
one, have a
it was
campfire
Galad who
going,
broke them. He
listening to
faced
a
their
book,
charge as though awaiting the next dance at a ball,
bubblegum
arms
kush,
folded and
nice, Nightmare,
unconcerned,
or
not
fire.
even bothering to bare his blade until they were almost on top of him. Then he did dance, all his grace turned in an instant to fluid death. He did not stand against them. He carved a path into their heart, a clear swath as wide as his sword's reach. Sometimes 5 or 6 men closed in around him with swords and axes and table legs for clubs, but only for the
No
brief
shit,
time it
Benny.
took them to die. In the
Wasn't
end,
that
all
good?
their rage, all their thirst for blood could not face him. It was from him that the first ran, flinging away weapons, and when the rest fled, they divided around him. As they vanished back the way they had come, he stood 20 paces from anyone else, alone among the dead
Black
and the
cherry sugar,
groans of the
nice.
dying.
I'm not sure what the
Nynaeve
dabs
shivered
was that
as
I
he
was
bent to
smoking.
clean his blade on a corpse's coat. He was graceful, even doing that. He was beautiful, even doing that. She thought she might sick up. She had no idea how long it had taken. Some of the Shienarans were leaning on their
Cause I got
swords,
that
panting,
dabs from
and eyeing Galad
one of my
with a great deal of
cousins.
respect. Tom was bent over with one hand on his
So I
knee,
got that,
trying to fend
dabs.
Elaine off with the other, while telling her he just had to catch his breath. Minutes? An hour? It could have been either. For once, looking at the injured men lying on the pavement here and there, the one crawling away, she felt no desire to heal, no pity at all. Not far off was a pitchfork where someone had flung it. A man's severed head was impaled on one tine, a woman's on another. All she felt was queasy, and grateful that it was not her head. That, and cold. "Thank you," she said aloud, to no one in particular and to everyone. "Thank you very much." The words grated a little. She did not like confessing something she had not been able to do for herself, but they were fervent. Then Brigitte nodded in acknowledgement, and Nynaeve had to struggle with herself. But the woman had done as much as anyone, considerably more than she herself. She thrust her belt knife back into its sheath. "You shot very well." With a wry grin, as if she knew exactly how difficult those words had been, Brigitte set about
I
recovering her
used
arrows.
some of
Nynaeve shuddered
my
and
juicy
tried not
tape
to
papers
watch.
to roll it.
Most of the Shienarans had wounds, and Tom and Julian both wore their own blood in places. Miraculously, Galad was untouched, or perhaps not so miraculously, remembering how he had handled his sword. But manlike to the bitter end, every one of them insisted that his hurts were not serious. Even Uno said they had to keep moving, him with one arm hanging and a gash down the side of his face, whose scar would nearly mirror the first if it was not healed soon. In truth, she was not reluctant to go, despite telling herself that she should be seeing to injuries. Elaine put a supporting arm around Tom. He responded by refusing to lean on her, and beginning to recite a tale in high chant, so flowery it was difficult to recognize the story of Kirukan, the beautiful soldier queen of the Trolloc Wars. She had a temper like a boar caught in briars at the best, Brigitte said softly to no one in particular. Not at all like anyone close by. Nynaeve ground her teeth. Catch her complimenting the woman again, no matter what she did. Come to think of it, any man in the Two Rivers could have shot as well at that range. Any boy. Rumbles followed them, distant roars from other streets, and often she had the feeling of eyes watching from one of the vacant glassless windows. But word must have spread, or else the watchers had seen what happened, because they saw no one else living until suddenly 24 white cloaks stepped into the street in front of them, half with drawn bows, the rest with bared blades. The Shinaran's blades were up in a heartbeat. Quick words between Galad and a fellow with a grizzled face beneath his conical helmet passed them through, though the man did eye the Shinarans doubtfully, and Tom and Julian, and for that matter Brigitte. It was enough to rankle Nynaeve. All very well for Elaine to march along with her chin raised, ignoring the white cloaks as though they were servants, but Nynaeve did not like being taken for granted. The river was not far. Beyond a few small stone warehouses under slate roofs, the town's 3 stone docks barely reached water over the dried mud. A fat vessel with 2 masts sat low at the end of one. Nynaeve hoped there would be no problem obtaining separate cabins. She hoped it would not heave too badly.
Where are my
A small crowd huddled 20 paces
oh
from
my
the dock,
little
under
car
the watchful
grinders.
eyes of 4 white-cloaked guards, nearly a dozen men, mainly old and all ragged and bruised, and twice as many women, most with 2 or 3 children clinging to them, some with a babe in arms beside. 2 more white cloaks stood right at the dock. The children hid their faces in their mothers' skirts, but the adults gazed yearningly at the ship. The sight wrenched at Nynaeve's heart. She remembered the same gazes, many more of them in Tanchico, people desperately hoping for a way to safety. She had not been able to do anything for those. Before she could do anything for these, Galad had seized her and Elaine by the arm and hustled them along the dock and down an unsteady gangplank. 6 more stern-faced men in white cloaks and burnished mails stood on the deck, watching a cluster of barefoot and mostly bare-chested men squatting in the bluff bows. It was close whether the captain at the foot of the plank gazed at the white cloaks more sourly, or at the motley party that trooped onto his ship. Agni Neres was a tall, bony man in a dark coat, with ears that stood out and a dour cast to his narrow face. He paid no mind to the sweat rolling down his cheeks. You paid me passage for 2 women. I suppose you want me to take the other wench and the men for free? Brigitte eyed him dangerously, but he seemed not to see. You shall have your fair money, my good captain, Elaine told him coolly. As long as it's reasonable, Nynaeve said, and ignored Elaine's sharp glance. Neres's mouth thinned, though it hardly seemed possible, and he addressed Galad again. Then if you'll get your men off my craft, I'll sail. I like being here in daylight now less than ever. As soon as you take your other passengers on, Nynaeve said, nodding to the people huddled ashore. Neres looked for Galad only to find that he had moved away to speak with the other white cloaks, then eyed the folk ashore and spoke to the air above Nynaeve's head. Any who can pay. Not many in that lot looked like they can, and I could not take the lot if they could. She raised herself on tiptoe so he could not possibly miss her smile. It snapped his chin down into his collar. Every last one of them, Captain, else I'll shave your ears off for you. The man's mouth opened angrily, then abruptly his eyes widened, staring past her. All right, he said quickly, but I expect some sort of payment, mind. I give alms on first day, and that's long past. Heels settling back to the deck, she looked over her shoulder suspiciously. Tom, Julian, and Uno stood there, blandly watching her and Neres, as blandly as they could manage with Uno's features and blood all over their faces. Far too blandly. With a sharp sniff, she said, I will see them all aboard before anybody touches a rope, and went in search of Galad. She supposed he deserved some thanks. He had thought what he was doing was the right thing. That was the trouble with the best of men. They always thought they were doing the right thing. Still, whatever the 3 had done, they had saved argument. She found him with Elaine, that handsome face painted with frustration. He brightened at the sight of her. Nynaeve, I've paid your way as far as Boanda. That's only halfway to Altara, where the Bourne runs into the Eldar, but I could not afford to pay further. Captain Neras took every copper in my purse, and I had to borrow besides. The fellow charges 10 prices. I'm afraid you will have to make your own way to Camelin from there. I truly am sorry. You have done quite enough already, Elaine put in, her eyes drifting toward the plumes of smoke rising above Samara. I gave my promise, he said, with a weary resignation. Plainly they had had the same exchange before Nynaeve came. Nynaeve managed to offer her thanks, which he dismissed graciously, but with a look as if she too did not understand, and she was more than ready to admit as much. He started a war to keep a promise. Elaine was right about that. It would be a war, if it was not already. Yet, with his men holding Neraz's ship, he would not demand a better price. It was Neraz's ship, and Neraz could charge as he chose, as long as he took Elaine and Nynaeve. It was true. Galad never counted the cost of doing right, not to himself or anyone else. At the gangplank he paused, staring at the town as if seeing the future. Stay clear of Rand al'Thor, he said bleakly. He brings destruction. He will break the world again before he is done. Stay clear of him. And he was trotting up to the dock, already calling for his armor. Nynaeve found herself sharing a wondering gaze with Elaine, though it quickly broke up in embarrassment. It was hard to share a moment like that with someone you knew might rake you with her tongue. At least, that was why she felt discomfort. Why Elaine should look flustered, she could not imagine, unless the woman was starting to come to her senses. Surely Galad did not suspect they had no intention of going to Camelin. Surely not. Men were never that perceptive. She and Elaine did not look at one another again for some
That's
time.
definitely a good hit on that one.
Chapter 49. To Boanda. There was little trouble getting the huddled crowd of men, women, and children aboard. Not once Nynaeve made it clear to Captain Neras that he was going to find room for everyone, and whatever he thought he was going to charge, she knew exactly how much she would give for their fares to Boanda. Of course, it might have helped a little that she'd taken the precaution of quietly telling Uno to have the Shinarans do something with their swords. 15 hard-faced, rough-dressed men, all with shaved heads and topknots, not to mention bloodstains, oiling and sharpening blades, laughing as one recounted how another had almost been spitted like a lamb. Well, they had a most salutary effect. She counted the money into her hand, and if it pained her, she only had to summon the memory of those docks at Tanchico to keep counting. Neras was right in one thing. These folk did not look to have much coin. They would need whatever coppers they had. Elaine had no call to ask in that sickly sweet tone if she was having a tooth pulled. The crew ran at Neras's shouted commands to cast off, while the last of the people were still scrambling aboard, carrying their wretched possessions in their arms, those who had anything at all beyond the rags on their backs. In truth, they crowded the fat vessels so that Nynaeve began to wonder whether Neras had been right about that, too. Yet such hope dawned on their faces once their feet were firmly on the deck that she was embarrassed to have considered it.
Real shit.
And when they learned she had paid their passage, they clustered around her,
That's
struggling
crazy,
to kiss her
Fire.
hands, the hem of her skirt, crying out thanks and blessings, some with tears streaming down dirty cheeks, men as well as women. She wished she could sink through the planks under her feet. The decks bustled as sweeps went out and sails rose, and Samara began to dwindle behind before she could put an end to the demonstration completely. If Elaine or Birgitta had said one word, she would have thumped them both twice around the ship for good measure. 5 days they were on River Serpent, 5 days running down the slowly winding Eldar through baking days and nights not much cooler. Some things changed for the better in that time, but the voyage did not begin well. The first real problem of the trip was Neras's cabin in the stern, the only accommodation on the ship except the deck. Not that Neras was reluctant about moving out. His haste, breeches and coats and shirts flung over his shoulders and dangling from a great wad in his arms, shaving mug clutched in one hand and razor in the other, made Nynaeve look hard at Tom and Julian and Uno. It was one thing for her to make use of them when she chose to, quite another for them to go looking after her behind her back. Their faces could not have been more open, or their eyes more innocent. Elaine brought up another of Linny's sayings. An open sack hides nothing, and an open door hides little, but an open man is surely hiding something. But whatever problem the men might prove to be, the problem now was the cabin itself. It smelled of must and mold, even with the tiny windows swung out, and they let little light into its dank confines. Confines was the word. The cabin was small, smaller than the wagon, and most of the space was taken by a heavy table and high-backed chair fastened to the floor, and the ladder leading up to the deck. A washstand built into the wall with a grimy pitcher and bowl and a narrow dusty mirror crowded the room still more, and completed the furnishings, except for a few empty shelves and pegs for hanging clothes. The ceiling beams crouched right overhead, even for them. And there was only one bed, wider than what they had been sleeping on, yet hardly wide enough for two. Tall as he was, Neres might as well have lived in a box. The man surely had not given up 1 inch that might be stuffed with cargo. He came to Samara in the night, Elaine muttered, unburdening herself of her bundles and putting hands on hips as she looked around disparagingly. And he wanted to leave in the night. I heard him tell one of his men that he meant to sail on through the night, whatever the wenches wanted. Apparently he's not much pleased to be moving in daylight. Thinking of the other woman's elbows and cold feet, Nynaeve wondered whether she would not have done better to sleep up above with the refugees. What are you going on about? The man is a smuggler, Nynaeve. In this vessel? Dropping her own bundles, Nynaeve laid the scrip on the table and sat down on the edge of the bed. No, she would not sleep on deck. The cabin might smell, but it could be aired out, and if the bed was cramped, it had a thick feather mattress. The ship did roll disturbingly. She might as well have what comfort she could. Elaine could not chase her out of there. It is a barrel. We will be lucky to reach Boanda in 2 weeks. The light alone knows how long to Salidar. Neither of them really knew how far Salidar was, and it was not yet time to broach the matter with Captain Neres. Everything fits, even the name. River Serpent. What honest trader would name his craft so? Well, what if he is? It wouldn't be the first time we've made use of a smuggler. Elaine threw up her hands in exasperation. She always did think obeying the law was important, however fool the law was. She shared more with Galad than she would be willing to admit. So Neres had called them wenches, had he? The second difficulty was room for the others. River Serpent was not a very large vessel, if wide, and counting everyone, there were well over 100 people aboard. A certain amount of space had to go to the crew working the sweeps and tending ropes and sails, and that did not matter for the passengers. It did not help that the refugees kept as far from the Shinarans as possible. It seemed they had had their fill of armed men. There was scarcely room for everyone to sit, and none for lying down. Nynaeve approached Neres straight away. These folk need more room, especially the women and children. Since you have no more cabins, your hold will have to do. Neres' face darkened. Staring straight ahead, somewhere a pace to her left, he growled, "My hold is full of valuable cargo. Very valuable cargo." I wonder if customs men are active along the Eldar here, Elaine said idly, eyeing the tree-lined banks to either side. The river was only a few hundred paces wide here, bordered with dried black mud and bare yellow clay. Gildan to one side and Amadicia to the other? It might seem odd, your hold full of goods from the south, and you heading south. Of course, you probably have all the documents showing where you paid duties, and you could explain that you didn't unload because of the troubles in Samara. I have heard that excise men are quite understanding, really. The corners of his mouth turning down, he still did not look at either of them, which was why he had a very good view when Tom fanned empty hands, made a flourish, and was suddenly twirling a pair of knives through his fingers before making one of them disappear. "Just keeping in practice," Tom said, scratching one long mustache with the other blade. "I like to maintain certain skills." The gash in his white-haired scalp and the fresh blood on his face, added to a blood-stained rent in one shoulder of his coat and tears elsewhere besides, made him look villainous in any company but Uno's. The Shinaran's toothy smile held no mirth at all, and did unfortunate things to his long scar and the new slash down his face, red and raw. The glaring crimson eye on his patch almost paled in comparison. Neres shut his eyes and drew a long, long breath. The hatches came open, and crates and casks went splashing over the side, some heavy, most light and smelling of spices. Neres winced every time the river closed over something else. He brightened, if such a thing could be said of him, when Nynaeve directed that bolts of silk and carpets and bales of fine woolens be left below, until he realized that she meant them for bedding. If his face had been sour before, now it could have curdled milk in the next room. When women began drawing up buckets of water on ropes to wash their children right there on the deck, he strode to the stern, hands clenched behind his back, and stared at the few floating casks as they fell behind. In a way, it was Neres's peculiar attitude toward women that began smoothing the edges from Elaine's acid tongue and Birgitta's. That was the way Nynaeve saw it. She herself had maintained her usual even disposition, of course. Neres disliked women. The crew spoke quickly when they had to speak to one of the women, all the while darting glances at the captain until they could hurry back to their duties. A fellow who seemed to have nothing to do for a moment was more likely than not to be sent running to some task by a roar from Neres if he exchanged 2 words with anyone in skirts. Their hasty comments and muttered warnings made Neres's opinions perfectly clear. Women cost a man money, they fought like alley cats, and they caused trouble. Any and all trouble a man had could be laid to women, one way or another. Neres expected half of them to be rolling on the deck, clawing one another before the first sunset. They would all flirt with his crew and bring on dissension where they did not cause fights. Could he have sent all women off his ship forever, he might have been happy. Could he have had them out of his life, he would have been ecstatic. Nynaeve had never encountered the like. Oh, she'd heard men mutter about women and money as if men did not fling coin about like water. They just had no head for money, less than Elaine. And she'd even heard them lay various troubles to women, usually when it was they themselves who had caused all the bother. But she could not recall ever meeting a man who truly disliked women. It was a surprise to learn that Neres had a wife and a horde of children in Ebou Dar, but no surprise that he stayed at home only long enough to load a new cargo. He did not even want to talk to a woman. It was simply amazing. Sometimes Nynaeve found herself looking at him sideways, the way she would have at some incredible animal, far stranger than Sredit, or anything else in Luca's menagerie. Naturally, there was no way that Elaine or Birgitta could vent their bile where he might hear. Rolling eyes and meaningful looks among Tom and the others were bad enough. They at least made some effort to hide them. Neres' open satisfaction at having his ridiculous expectations met, he surely would have seen it so. That would have been unbearable. He left them no choice but to swallow their acid and smile. For herself, Nynaeve could have done with a little time with Tom and Uno and Julian away from Neres' eye. They were forgetting themselves again, forgetting they were supposed to do as they were told. The results did not matter. They should wait. And for some reason they had taken to tormenting Neres with darkly smiling comments about cracking heads and slitting throats. But the only place she could be sure of avoiding Neres was in the cabin. They were not particularly large men, though Tom was tall and Uno fairly wide, yet crowded in there, they would have filled the tiny space to where they were looming over her. Hardly conducive to the tongue-lashing she wanted to hand out. Give a man the chance to loom, and he had the battle half won. So she put on a pleasant mask, ignored startled frowns from Tom and Julian, incredulous stares from Uno and Regan, and enjoyed the outward good temper the other women had been forced to adopt. She managed to keep smiling when she learned why the sails were so full, the undulating riverbanks rushing by under the afternoon as fast as a trotting horse. Neres had had the sweeps pulled in and stored along the railings. He looked almost happy. Almost. A low clay bluff ran along the Amadisia River. On the Gildan side lay a broad ribbon of reeds between river and trees, mainly brown where water had receded. Samara lay only a few hours upriver. "You channeled," she said to Elaine through her teeth. Wiping sweat from her brow with the back of her hand, she resisted the urge to dash it to the slowly heaving deck. The other passengers left a clear space for the two of them, and Brigitte a few paces across, but she still kept her voice low, and as affable as she could manage. Her stomach seemed to move a heartbeat behind the ship's roll. That hardly improved her temper. "This wind is your doing." She hoped there was enough red fennel in her scrip. From Elaine's damply glowing countenance and wide eyes, milk and honey should have fountained from her mouth. "You are turning into a frightened rabbit. Pull yourself together. Samara is miles behind us. No one could sense anything useful from that far. She would have to be on the ship with us to know. I was very quick." Nynaeve thought her own face might crack if she held her smile any longer, but out of the corner of her eye she could see Neras, studying his passengers and shaking his head. Angry as she was at that moment, she could also see the almost faded residue of the other woman's weaving. Working weather was like rolling a stone downhill. It tended to keep going the way you started it. When it bounced away from the path, as it would sooner or later, you just had to twitch it back. Mogadine might have felt a weave of that size from Samara, maybe. And she did want to travel as quickly as possible. Right then, one day more than necessary in close quarters with the other two held as much attraction for her as sharing the cabin with Neras. For that matter, an extra day on the water was nothing to look forward to. How could a ship move in such a fashion when the river looked so flat? Smiling was beginning to make her lips ache. "You should have asked, Elaine. You always go and do things without asking, without thinking. It's time you realized if you fall into a hole running blindly, your old nurse isn't going to come pick you up and wash your face." By the last word, Elaine's eyes were as round as teacups, and her bared teeth looked ready to bite. Brigitte put a hand on each of them, leaning close and beaming as though joy had her by the throat. "If you two don't stop this, I'm going to tip you both into the river to cool off. You are both acting like Shago barmaids with winter itch." Sweating faces frozen in amiability, the three women stalked in different directions, just as far apart as the ship would allow. Near sunset, Nynaeve heard Rhaegan say that she and the others must really be relieved to be away from Samara, the way they were all but laughing on one another's shoulder, and the other men seemed to do the same. The rest of the women aboard watched them with faces much too serious. They knew trouble when they saw it. Yet, bit by bit, that trouble oozed away. Nynaeve was not exactly sure how. Perhaps the pleasant smiles Elaine and Brigitte put on just seeped inside in spite of them. Perhaps the ridiculousness of it all, trying to keep a friendly smile on your face while putting a proper bite into your words, struck them more and more. Whatever did it, she could not complain at the outcome. Slowly, day by day, words and tones began to match faces, and now and then one of them even looked embarrassed, plainly remembering how she had been behaving. Neither spoke one word of apology, of course, which Nynaeve quite understood. Had she been as foolish and vicious as they, she certainly would not want to remind anyone. The children played a part in restoring Elaine and Brigitte to equilibrium too, though it actually started with Nynaeve looking after the men's wounds that first morning on the river. She brought out her scrip full of herbs, making poultices and ointments, bandaging cuts. Those gowns made her angry enough to heal. Sickness and injury always made her angry, and she did so for some of the worst, though she had to be careful. Wounds vanishing would have set people talking, and the Light knew what Neras would do if he thought he had an Aes Sedai aboard. Very likely sneak a man ashore in Amadisia by night and try to have them arrested. For that matter, the news might have sent some of the refugees over the side. With Uno, for example, she rubbed a touch of stinging mardroot oil liniment into his heavily bruised shoulder, dabbed a bit of heel oil ointment on the fresh slash down his face, no point wasting either, and wrapped his head in bandages until he could hardly move his jaw before healing him. When he gasped and flailed, she said briskly, "Don't be such a baby. I wouldn't have thought a little pain would bother a big, strong man. Now you leave those alone. If you even touch them in the next 3 days, I'll dose you with something you won't soon forget." He nodded slowly, staring at her so uncertainly that it was plain he did not know what she had done. If he realized when he finally took the bandages off, with luck, no one else would remember exactly how bad the gash had been, and he should have sense enough to keep his mouth shut. Once she began, it was only natural to go on to the rest of the passengers. Few of the refugees lacked bruises and scrapes, and some of the children were showing signs of fevers or wounds. Those she could heal without worry. Children always made a fuss when they were dosed with anything that did not taste of honey. If they told their mothers it had felt odd, children always had fancies. She had never really been comfortable around children. True, she wanted to have Lan's babies. Never did. Children could make a mess from nothing. They seemed to have the habit of doing the opposite of what you told them as soon as your back was turned, just to see how you would react. Yet she found herself smoothing back the dark hair of a boy no higher than her waist, who stared up at her owlishly with bright blue eyes. They looked very like Lan's eyes. Elaine and Brigitte joined the order at first, but once they gravitated to the children. Strangely, Brigitte did not look at all silly with a boy of 3 or 4 cradled. She did not look guilty at all when Nynaeve caught her sneaking one into her own mouth. She only grinned, gently pulled the little girl's thumb from her mouth, and replaced it with another candy. The children laughed as if just remembering how, and snuggled themselves into Nynaeve's skirts, or Elaine's or Brigitte's, as easily as into their mothers. It was very difficult to maintain any sort of temper in those circumstances. She could not even bring herself to do more than sniff, and that faintly, when Elaine resumed her study of the eidam in the privacy of the cabin on the second day. The woman seemed more convinced than ever that the bracelet, necklace, and leash created a strange form of linking. Nynaeve even sat with her once or twice. The sight of the vile thing itself was enough to enable her to embrace silence and follow along. The refugee stories came out, of course. Families separated, lost or dead. Farms and shops and crafts ruined as ripples of the world's troubles spread out, disrupting trade. People could not buy when they could not sell. The Prophet had only been the last brick on the cart that broke the axle. Nynaeve said nothing when she saw Elaine slipping a gold mark to a fellow with thin gray hair, who knuckled a wrinkled forehead and tried to kiss her hand. She would learn how fast gold vanished. Besides, Nynaeve had handed out a few coins herself. Well, perhaps more than a few. All but 2 of the men were grizzled or balding, with leathery faces and work-callous hands. Younger men had been snatched into the army if they were not caught up by the Prophet. Those who refused one or the other had been hanged. The young pair, little more than boys, really. Nynaeve doubted if either had to shave regularly, wore hunted stares, and flinched if one of the Shinarans looked at them. Sometimes the older men talked of starting over, finding a bit of land to farm or taking up their trade again, but the tone of their voices said it was more bluff and bravado than real hope. Mostly they talked quietly of their families, a wife lost, sons and daughters lost, grandchildren lost. They sounded lost. The second night, a jug-eared fellow who had seemed the most enthusiastic in a sad lot had just vanished. He was simply gone when the sun came up. He might have swum ashore. Nynaeve hoped he had. Still, it was the women who caught her heart. They had no more prospects than the men, no more certainties, but most had more burdens. None had a husband with her, or even knew if she had a husband alive, yet the responsibilities that weighed them down also kept them moving. No woman with grit could give up when she had children. Even the others meant to find some future, though. They all had at least a scrap of the hope the men only pretended to. 3 especially tugged at her. Nicola was about her age and height, a slender dark-haired weaver with big eyes who had been intending to marry, until her Hiron took it into his head that duty called him to follow the prophet, to follow the dragon reborn. He would marry her when his duty was seen to. Duty had been very important to Hiron. He would have made a good and conscientious husband and father, so Nicola said. Only whatever was in his head had not done him much good when someone split it with an axe. Nicola did not know who or why, just that she had to get as far from the prophet as she could. Somewhere, there had to be a place where there was no killing, where she would not always be in fear of what might be around the next corner. Marigan, a few years older, had been plump once, but her frayed brown dress hung on her loosely now, and her blunt face looked beyond weary. Her 2 sons, 6 and 7, stared silently at the world with 2 big eyes. Clinging to each other, they seemed frightened of everything and everyone else, even their own mother. Marigan had dealt in cures and herbs in Samara, though she had some odd ideas about both. That was no wonder, really. A woman who offered healing with Amadisia and white cloaks right across the river had to keep low, and even from the first, she had had to teach herself. All she had ever wanted to do was cure sickness, and she claimed to have done it well, though she had not been able to save her husband. The 5 years since his death had been hard, and the coming of the prophet had certainly not helped her any. Mobs searching for Aes Sedai chased her into hiding after she had cured a man of fever, and rumor had turned it into bringing him back from the dead. That was how little most people knew of Aes Sedai. Arena was the youngest of the 3, with steady blue eyes and a face bruised purple and yellow, and not from Gildan at all. Her clothes would have said that if nothing else did. A short dark coat and voluminous trousers not much different from Brigitta's. They were the sum of her possessions. She would not say where she was from exactly, but she was forthcoming about the road that had led her to River Serpent, about some of it. Nynaeve had to infer in places. Arena had gone to Ilion, meaning to bring her younger brother home before he could take the oath as a hunter for the Horn. With thousands in the city, however, she had never found him, but somehow she had found herself taking the oath, setting out to see the world while not quite believing the Horn of Valir existed, half hoping that somewhere she would find young Gwyll and take him home. Things had been difficult since. Arena was not precisely reluctant to talk, but she made such an effort to put a good face on things. She'd been chased out of several villages, robbed once, and beaten several times. Even so, she had no intention of giving up or seeking sanctuary or a peaceful village. The world was still out there, and Arena meant to wrestle it to the ground. Not that she put it that way, but Nynaeve knew it was what the woman meant. Nynaeve knew very well why they touched her most, too. Each story could have been the reflection of a thread in her own life. What she did not quite understand was why she liked Arena best. It was her opinion, putting this and that together, that nearly all of Arena's troubles came from having too free a tongue, telling people exactly what she thought. It could hardly be coincidence that she was harried out of one village so quickly she had to leave her horse behind after calling the mayor a pie-faced loon and telling some village women that Dry Bones kitchen sweepers had no right to question why she was on the road alone. That was what she admitted to saying. Nynaeve thought a few days of herself, for example, would do Arena worlds of good, and there had to be something she could do for the other 2 as well. She could understand a desire for safety and peace very well.
All right.
There was an odd exchange the morning of the 2nd day, while tempers were still tender and tongues, some people's tongues, still rough. Nynaeve said something quite mildly about Elaine not being in her mother's house, though she need not think Nynaeve was going to sleep shoved against the wall every night. Elaine tilted up her chin, but before she could open her mouth, Brigitta blurted, "You are the daughter Erebandor?" She hardly looked around to make sure Elaine was close enough to hear. "I am." Elaine sounded more dignified than Nynaeve remembered in some time, but there was a hint of, could it be satisfaction? Face completely blank, Brigitte simply turned away, walking up into the bow where she sat on a coil of rope, staring at the river ahead. Elaine frowned after her, then finally went to sit beside her. They sat talking silently for some time. Nynaeve would not have joined them, even had she been asked. Whatever they discussed, Elaine seemed slightly disconcerted, as if she had expected some other result. But after that, there was hardly a cross word between them. Brigitte resumed her own name later that same day, though it was a last flare of temper that did it. With Mokadeen safely behind them, she and Elaine washed the black out of their hair with poke leaf, and Nera's seeing one with red gold curls about her shoulders, and the other yellow gold in an intricate braid, and that one with bow and quiver, muttered acridly about Brigitte stepping out of the bloody stories. It was his misfortune that she overheard. That was her name, she told him sharply, and if he did not like it, she would pin his ears to either mast he chose, blindfolded, and red faced and shouting for lines of imprisonment that could not have been made any tighter without. At that point, Nynaeve would not have cared whether Brigitte actually carried out the threat. The might have left a slight reddish cast to her own hair, yet it was close enough to its natural color almost to make her cry for joy. Unless everyone aboard came down with mistakes, she had more than enough for meaning, and sufficient red fennel to keep her stomach in its place. She could not help sighing in satisfaction once her hair was dry and in a proper braid again. Of course, with Elaine channeling good winds and Nera's running the misnamed craft was, it made good time, rolling along downriver. Nera seemed torn between pleasure at his good luck at such winds and worry at moving in daylight. More than once he gazed longingly at a backwater, a tree-shrouded stream or pool cut deep into the bank, where River Serpent might have been moored and hidden. Occasionally, Nynaeve remarked where he could hear about how glad he must be that the people from Samara would soon be off his ship, with a comment thrown in about how well this woman was looking now that she was rested, or how energetic that woman's children were. That was enough to put ideas of stopping right out of his head. It might have been easier to threaten him with the Shinarans, or Tom and Jewelin, but those fellows were getting entirely too big-headed as it was, and she certainly had no intention of arguing with a man who still would neither look at her nor talk to her. Gray dawning of the third day saw the crew manning the sweeps again to draw them into a dock at Boanda. It was a considerable town, larger than Samara, on a point of land where the swift river Bourne, coming down from Johanna, ran into the slower Eldar. There were even 3 towers inside the tall gray walls, and a building shining white beneath a red tile roof that could certainly pass for a palace, if a small one. As River Serpent was lashed fast to the heavy pilings at the end of one dock, half their length across dried mud, Nynaeve wondered aloud why Neras had gone all the way to Samara when he could have unloaded his goods here. Elaine nodded toward a stout man on the dock who wore a chain with some sort of seal hanging across his chest. There were several others like him, all with the chain and a blue coat, intently watching 2 other broad vessels unload at other docks. Queen Aleandra's excisemen, I should say. Drumming his fingers on the rail, Neras was not looking at the men just as intently as they were at the other vessels. Perhaps he had an arrangement with those in Samara. I don't think he wants to talk to these. The men and women from Samara marched reluctantly up the gangplank, ignored by the excisemen. There was no custom duty on people. For the Samarans it was the beginning of uncertainty. They had their lives ahead of them, and to begin anew what they stood up in and what Nynaeve and Elaine had given them. Before they were halfway down the dock, still huddling together, some of the women were beginning to look as disheartened as the men. Some even began to cry. Vexation painted Elaine's face. She always wanted to take care of everyone. Nynaeve hoped Elaine did not discover that she had slipped a few more silvers to some of the women. Not all left the ship. Arena remained, and Nicola and Marigan, tightly clutching her sons, who gazed in anxious silence after the other children vanishing toward the town. The two lads had not said a word since Samara that Nynaeve had heard. "I want to go with you," Nicola told Nynaeve, unconsciously wringing her hands. "I feel safe near you." Marigan nodded emphatically. Arena said nothing, but she stepped closer to the other two women, making herself part of the group, even as she looked levelly at Nynaeve, defying her to send her away. Tom shook his head slightly, and Julian grimaced, but it was to Elaine and Brigitte that Nynaeve looked. Elaine did not hesitate in nodding, and the other woman was only a second behind. Gathering her skirts, Nynaeve marched to Neera's standing in the stern. "I suppose I will have my ship back now," he told the air somewhere between the ship and the dock. "Not before time. This voyage has been the worst I ever undertook." Nynaeve smiled broadly. For once he did look at her before she was done. Well, he almost did. It was not as if Neera's had much choice. He could hardly appeal to the authorities in Boanda, and if he did not like the fares she offered, well, he had to sail downriver anyway. So the river serpent cast off again, heading for Ebou Dar, with one stop to be made that he was not informed of until Boanda began falling astern. "Salidar," he growled, staring over Nynaeve's head. "Salidar's been abandoned since the White Cloak War. It would take a fool woman to want to be ashore at Salidar." Even smiling, Nynaeve was angry enough to embrace the source. Neera's roared, slapping at his neck and his hip at the same time. And River Serpent lumbered into the strong current flowing out of the bourne. She was all but eating red fennel for meals, but even if she ran out before Salidar, she would not care. Their journey was almost over. Everything she had been through was worth it for that. Of course, she had not always thought so,
Yeah, cheers,
and Elaine and Brigitte's rasping hands had not been the only cause. That first night, lying on the captain's bed in her shift, while a yawning Elaine occupied the chair and Brigitte leaned against the door with her head brushing the beams, Nynaeve had used the twisted stone ring. A single, rusty, gimbal-mounted lamp gave light, and, surprisingly, a scent of spice from the oil. Maybe Neera's had not liked the stench of must and mold either. If she was ostentatious about nestling the ring between her breasts and making sure the others knew it touched skin, well, she had cause. A few hours of superficially reasonable behavior on their parts had not made her less wary. The heart of the stone was exactly as it had been every time before, pale light coming from everywhere and nowhere, the glittering crystal sword Callandor thrust into the floor stones beneath the great dome, rows of huge polished redstone columns running off into shadow. And that sensation of being watched that was so common in Tel'aran'rhiod. It was all Nynaeve could do not to flee, or set off on a frantic search through the columns. She forced herself to stand in one place beside Callandor, counting slowly to 1,000, and pausing every 100 to call Egwene's name. Truly, it was all she could do. The control she was so proud of vanished. Her clothes flickered with her worries about herself and Mogadine, Egwene and Rand and Lan. Between 1 minute and the next, stout Two Rivers woolens became a muffling cloak and deep hood, which became a suit of white cloak mail, which became the red silk dress, transparent, which became an ever thicker cloak, which became... She thought her face changed, too. Once she saw her hands, with skin darker than Julian's. Perhaps if Mogadine could not recognize her. "Egwene!" The last hoarse call echoed among the columns, and Nynaeve made herself stand there shivering for one more count of 100. The great chamber remained empty except for her. Wishing she could feel more regret than haste, she stepped out of the dream. and lay fingering the stone ring on its thong, staring at the thick beams above the bed and listening to the thousand creaks of the ship rushing downriver through the darkness. Was she there? Elaine demanded. You were not gone very long, but... I am tired of being afraid, Nynaeve said without taking her gaze from the beams. I am so tired of being a coward. The last words dissolved into tears she could neither stop nor hide, no matter how she scrubbed at her eyes. Elaine was there in an instant, holding her and smoothing her hair, and an instant later, Brigitte pressed a cloth dampened in cool water against the back of her neck. She cried herself out to the sound of them telling her she was not a coward. If I thought Mogadin was hunting me, Brigitte said finally, I would run. If there was no other place to hide than a badger hole, I would wriggle in and curl into a ball and sweat until she was gone. I would not stand in front of one of Sarandon's Sredit if it charged either, and neither is cowardice. You must choose your own time and your own ground, and come at her in the way she least expects. I will take my revenge on her if ever I can, but that is the only way I will. Anything else would be foolish. That was hardly what Nynaeve wanted to hear, but her tears and their comfort made another gap in the thorny hedges that had grown up between them. I will prove to you that you are no coward. Taking the dark wooden box from the shelf where she had put it, Elaine removed the spiral-scribed iron disc. We will go back together. That Nynaeve wanted to hear, but there was no way to avoid it, not after they had told her she was not a coward. So back they went. To the Stone of Tyr, where they stared at Callandor, better than looking over your shoulder and wondering whether Mogadin was going to appear. Then to the royal palace, carpets and elaborate hangings. But this was where Elaine had grown up. Seeing it and knowing that made her understand a little of Elaine. Of course the woman expected the world to bend itself to her. She had grown up being taught that it would, in a place where it did. Elaine, a pale image of herself because of the ter'angreal she was using, was strangely quiet while they were there. But then Nynaeve was quiet in Emond's Field. For one thing, the village was larger than she remembered, with more thatch-roofed houses and others wooden frameworks going up. Someone was building a very big house just outside the village, 3 sprawling stories, and a stone plinth 5 paces high had been erected on the green, carved all over with names. A good many she recognized. They were mostly Two Rivers names. A flagpole stood to either side of the plinth, one topped by a banner with a red wolf's head, the other one with a red eagle. Everything looked prosperous and happy, as much as she could say, with no people there, but it made no sense. What on earth were those banners, and who would be building such a house? They flashed to the White Tower, to Elida's study. Nothing had changed there except that only 6 stools remained in the semicircle in front of Elida's table, and the triptych of Bonwyn was gone. The painting of Rand remained, with a poorly mended tear in the canvas across Rand's face, as if someone had thrown something at it. They rifled the papers in the lacquered box with its golden hawks, and those on the keeper's table in the anteroom. Documents and letters changed while they looked at them, yet they did learn a little. Elida knew that Rand had crossed the Dragon Wall into Cairhien, but of what she intended to do about it there was no clue. An angry demand that all Aes Sedai return to the tower immediately unless they had specific orders otherwise from her. Elida seemed to be angry about a good deal, that so few sisters had returned after her offer of amnesty, that most of the eyes and ears in Tarabon were still silent, that Pedron Nile was still calling white cloaks back to Amadisia when she did not know why, that Davram Bashir still could not be found despite having an army with him. Fury filled every document over her seal. None of it seemed of real use or interest, except maybe about the white cloaks. Not that they should have any difficulty there, as long as they were on River Serpent. When they returned to their bodies on the ship, Elaine was silent as she rose from the chair and replaced the disc in the box. Without thinking, Nynaeve got up to help her out of her dress. Brigitte scrambled up the ladder as they climbed into the bed together in their shifts. She intended to sleep right at the top of the ladder, she said. Elaine channeled to extinguish the lamp. After a time lying in the dark, she said, "The palace seemed so empty, Nynaeve. It felt so empty." Nynaeve did not know what else a place was supposed to be in Tel Rhiod. "It was the ter'angreal you used. You looked almost foggy to me." "Well, I looked just fine to me." There was only a touch of asperity in Elaine's voice, though, and they settled down to sleep. Nynaeve had remembered the other woman's elbows accurately, but they could not diminish her good mood, and neither could Elaine's complaining murmur that she had cold feet. She had done it. Perhaps forgetting to be afraid was not the same as not being afraid, but at least she had gone back to the world of dreams. Perhaps one day she could find the nerve again not to be afraid. Having begun, it was easier to go on than to stop. Every night after that, they entered Tel Rhiod together, always with a visit to the tower to see what they could learn. There was not very much, besides an order sending an emissary to Salidar to invite the Aes Sedai there to return to the tower. Except the invitation, much as Nynaeve could read before it changed to a report on screening potential novices for proper attitudes, whatever that was supposed to mean, was more a demand that those Aes Sedai submit to Elaida immediately and be thankful they were allowed to. Still, it was confirmation that they were not chasing a wild hare. The trouble with the rest of what they saw in fragments was they did not know enough to fit them together. Who was this Davram Bashir, and why was Elaida so frantic to find him? Why had Elaida forbidden anyone to mention the name of Masrim Time, the false dragon, with a threat of stiff penalties? Why had Queen Tenobia of Saldaea and King Isar of Shinar aside from the trips to Elaida's study,
I'm
they
not sure
worked
why
at
it
learning
keeps doing
control
that.
of themselves and their surroundings in the world of dreams. Nynaeve did not mean to let herself be caught again as she had been by Egwene, and by the Wise Ones. Mogadin she tried not to think about. Much better to concentrate on the Wise Ones. Of Egwene's trick of appearing in their dreams, as she had in Samara, they could puzzle out nothing. Calling her did nothing except increase that uneasy feeling of being watched, and she did not make another such appearance. Trying to hold somebody else in Tel Rhiod was incredibly frustrating, even after Elaine hit on the trick, which was to see the other as just another part of the dream. Elaine did it finally, and Nynaeve congratulated her with as good grace as she could muster, but for days Nynaeve could not. Elaine might as well have been the near miss of conceit, vanishing with a smile when...
Alright, I'm probably gonna call into this live for right now. But I definitely appreciate all y'all that stop by and keep stopping by and chilling with me. Appreciate all y'all's support. Till next time, y'all stay safe out there.